Alright, welcome everybody. If you're looking for 3D electrical harnesses, you're in the right place. So if you did attend the first part of this series, we're kind of continuing on that same path there. In fact, I'll bring up that schematic just briefly so you can kind of get a refresher. If this is your first time to this webinar series, we're doing a 4-part series. This is piece number 2. A little bit about me. So that's me. For those that don't know what those rock wall things are stuck in wire cages, that's a gabion wall. In fact, it's one here in Scottsdale, Arizona. In fact, recently somebody recognized it, so I was kind of shocked. But gabion walls for retention, but they're starting to turn into a architectural accent piece too. So, but yeah, I've definitely been using SOLIDWORKS CAD for quite a while, SOLIDWORKS Electrical since it was adopted, and then also I've been SOLIDWORKS reseller channel for quite some time there too. So just hit my 14 years beginning of this month actually. So all right. So for those that don't know what SOLIDWORKS Electrical 3D is, it's an add-in for SOLIDWORKS CAD. So this is kind of wordy, so I'll kind of summarize it. But licenses, you can do a network version, standalone version, so it can be floating or not. It is an add-on to SOLIDWORKS CAD, so you do still need a SOLIDWORKS CAD license. So if there's anybody in the group today where you're wanting to get into electrical 3D, you also have to make sure that you have a CAD license to go along with that. But contact your GoEngineer account manager. They can definitely get you quotes for whatever you need. The other part of electrical 3D, and this is another question that comes up when somebody hasn't really dug in a whole lot and seen what the product's about. So yeah, network license, it is an add-in for SOLIDWORKS CAD. The other part of it though is you don't have to have SOLIDWORKS Premium that actually has a routing capability. You can have SOLIDWORKS Standard and get electrical 3D. So you don't have to have the full-blown high-end version of SOLIDWORKS CAD. So, all right, so roadmap for today. So that's kind of what we're looking at as far as the steps and process. This session is getting recorded. All 4 of these are getting recorded. They'll be broadcast or posted on our YouTube channel. So if there's any portion that you do miss, you can certainly go back to that. This is kind of generally where we're headed. If you've done any electrical 3D, some of these things will seem familiar. Some of them will be new and exciting type of things. So, but it's all kind of harness geared or harness related here. And again, that's where my roadmap stops. And then again, Jonathan Lieber will be getting some additional items and a little bit of overlap. Of course, there's always a little bit of that, just because lots of info to encompass with these. So, all right, so let's kind of dive in here. So let's so one of the very first things when we're talking about SOLIDWORKS 3D is where your assemblies should reside. In fact, let's open up schematics here first, just so we can kind of get a quick little recap, and then we'll talk assembly stuff here second. So that's the same project that we were working on last week. In fact, I think it's even got the same wires that I was drawing last week, so we're continuing on with that. May have moved things around, reorganized it, that type of thing. So that's going to be what drives are from too. One of the other reasons I like to point this out again is the connections that are occurring between how many wires are going to one point, so 2 to a single pin, other ones just have or 2 wires to one pin, single wires to a single pin. That type of thing is all dictated by the schematic itself. So if this isn't doing what you want, neither will the 3D assembly. So that's the one we're going with. I'm going to go and open up SOLIDWORKS CAD itself. I've already got the add-in loaded, so we get that little tab over on the right-hand side. Again, I'm doing my I did my two-part series in 21. The reason I did that is just so that the file sets are still in 21. But all right, so getting into the project manager, I'm going to open up that same one that I have open in schematics there. Project document tree or page tree is exactly the same. Currently has no assemblies in it, so that's kind of where we're getting at into the first slide here. In fact, let's go and bring that one back up here again. So first slide is, okay, where do we want our assemblies to go? They can exist in the electrical project, so on the electrical server in the folder that correlates to the physical files of that project, or do we want them outside that project, which I got a little crazy with the last line there, but so yes, you could put those assemblies outside of the project or outside the electrical server in PDM on your local vault view. And we're only talking assemblies at this point. Later on, we'll talk about the intelligent parts that we'll be creating and going through that. So let's take a look at something here. So I'm going into the electrical 3D. So again, that's the tab on the right there. I'll go up to the Tools menu, SOLIDWORKS Electrical, down to the Process, and over to SOLIDWORKS Assembly. This, if you went into the schematics program, the program I brought up earlier, on the Processes tab, you can do the same operation. So it can be done in Electrical 3D, or it can also be done in schematics. Either place there. So what this allows us to do is one of two things. We can either link a project. Let's get that brought over here. So we can link a project to be, well, we can have one internal to the project, or we can have one external. Which, let's take a look at this before, if you've never seen the screen before. For every project, you get one for the project level, so an assembly that can be very top level. And then you can also have one for each location. Our location, we renamed it to be H1. Normally, locations are L1, L2 type of thing, but I renamed mine to H1. So realistically, both of these in this project's case would be the same, but if I had like a sub-location of H1 or another parent location, well, you only see the components in that location for when we go to the step of associating. So that is one of those things to be aware of. For our purpose, we're just going to focus on a project level one, so uncheck the bottom there. I'm not going to do any other changes in this dialog for the first go of it, and I'm going to go and hit OK there. So when I hit OK there in that dialog, here in a moment we'll actually see an assembly icon show up in our document tree. This particular file gets created in the project folder specifically for this project on the electrical server. And again, all depending on kind of your setup, that electrical server could be an actual server that everybody's connected to, or it could be a local server. So if I look at the properties of it, so I right-click Properties, I'll bring that over here. So that was a right-click over the assembly properties in there. I'm kind of focused in this area, in the properties section there. So when it creates one in the project, it just gives it a generic number, essentially an assigned value for the project database to keep track of it. That can be changed. But one thing I want to point out, though, and we'll see an extra row show up here in a moment, but with a project that resides in the project folder on the electrical server, it doesn't give you a path of where that's at. When we do a linked assembly, we'll actually see another row show up between file name and title block. So kind of look for that here in a little bit. So I'm going to rename this, and I do that by canceling out of the properties. I don't want the assembly to be open. I need to do a right-click rename. And then I can go and change that to whatever I want. So I'm going to say Web 3 Connector. So that's the name of my assembly. So it gets renamed out on the electrical server. So if I was to open that one, kind of an easy way of seeing where that resides at, and mind you, my setup is I'm all self-contained. If I go up to the File menu and find References, it's going to tell you that it's actually on my electrical server, which again, it happens to be program data. If you're using a shared server, it's going to be something like / name of server and then the SOLIDWORKS Electrical folder, so a network share. And then this happens to be project 66, and if I looked at the ID number in my project manager. So that's how it designates where it's getting put into. Realistically, you shouldn't open that assembly without the project being open. In fact, a lot of the newer versions of Electrical 3D, it does, if you open the assembly from that directory, it's going to open up the project anyways. It's going to force you to do that. I'm going to say don't save it. And then I'm going to delete it out of the tree. So that's a project that resides in the electrical project folder there. So when I've deleted it, now I can go back and do a different assembly. I can actually go through and do a process, SOLIDWORKS assembly. Same thing again here. But this time I'm going to look at this far right column here, this select existing file. This button's a little kind of crazy. I'm going to intentionally kind of highlight this. If you have a row highlighted and you try to hit that ellipses button there on the far right there, it's not going to do anything. You have to deselect it and then click on that button. It's just a little quirk about that interface that's been around for a while. So I click on the button, jumps me into an open dialog to go browsing out for my file. So I'll get out to my C drive, go to where I've already started an assembly. In fact, let's go and jump down to that here. I would give you a preview, but my preview tab on my Vault View is in between working right now. I hadn't gotten around to getting it fixed before we started today. But so this assembly, I consider a mechanical assembly at this point because you technically could build this assembly without the electrical add-in turned on. All it is a construct of parts, sub-assemblies, and even a sketch in it, checked into the PDM vault. Yes, I do have ownership of it. Again, if you're familiar with PDM, great. If you're not, this could be on a network share or somewhere outside of the electrical project. Careful with this though, because it needs to be in a common place if you're going to have multiple people working on this assembly and this electrical project. So it needs to be a common repository, especially if you have multiple users. Alright, so I'm going to open up that assembly, and it sometimes takes a little bit, sometimes it pops in right away, but it gives me the name of the assembly in that external directory. Yes, it's PDM, but it could be just a Windows folder where that assembly resides at. So now when I hit OK there, the icon's slightly different. If you really squint at it, there's a little cube in the corner, and that if you even squint even harder, there's actually a shortcut icon inside of that. It's basically telling me that that assembly is outside of the electrical server. The easy way of truly seeing it, though, is I right-click, I go to Properties, and then it gave me a generic name again for the shortcut link, but then we see that target file path show up. So now this is giving me the path location of where that assembly resides outside of it. So what's the advantage, disadvantage of it? So kind of the end of the short of it is, okay, are we going to be duplicating that project? Do we want the assemblies and the parts to come along for the ride when we duplicate it? That also kind of correlates to if we duplicate it for like an alternate version type of thing, we run into scenarios where the association has to be redone. So if it's only a few parts, that's not that big of a deal. If it's several hundred, that could be time consuming. Duplication sometimes does maintain associations, but keep in mind this is still going to point back towards the same assembly. It's not duplicating the assembly. Again, what I'm referring to here is in the project manager. If I had a project and I did a duplicate of that project, all it does is makes a new project. I give it a new name. It does not duplicate the the file set. If I did an assembly and its parts embedded in that project and I duplicate it, I get an exact copy of it. Same file name, same assembly names in that project. So something to definitely kind of work with, see which one works best for you. I do find that companies that have like PDM Pro, that's not a bad place for it. It does give visibility to other people outside of the electrical department. So again, I do strongly advise kind of not doing working on electrical assemblies once it's been linked or embedded when the project is not open, which goes to my next slide here. So let's go and bring up this slide here. So this is kind of something to kind of wrap your head around. You can organize your mechanical assemblies and your electrical assemblies essentially however you want. My ideal, you see that up here, is that we put any components, so 3D parts that we're going to be connecting or running wires to, in electrical assemblies, and even better ideal, in the same electrical assembly. So you're going from one electrical assembly to the other. That being said, it does work if you cross between two electrical assemblies or electrical and mechanical. In fact, you'll see I've got a scenario similar to this over here on the far right, where I have an electrical assembly and I've dropped in a mechanical sub-assembly, which has an electrical part in it. So you can still do the association, but it does require an extra click or so. But again, something to kind of think about on how you want to organize. You can certainly take the approach on the right-hand side, where you have this overall large mechanical assembly, and you just embed your electrical assemblies as subs there, and then you just link them. Okay. All right. So moving on, let's start talking about. Let's get the slide to advance here. There we go. So 3D connector intelligence. So yes, I'm specifically gearing this towards a harness, so I'm referring to connectors, but this could be any part that you're wanting to make electrically intelligent, so you can use it for routing wires. The part can be anything you want. It could be a cube that you drew, it could be something you downloaded. I do recommend that you clean it up. Make sure you do an import diagnostics on it, make sure that it is a stable file, not something that's like half surface body or something like that. Sometimes it's faster to redraw it than it is to fix a part. But and then my second statement on this slide is, do we use the wizard or not use the wizard to add connection points? And I'll talk to that here in a moment. So let's go and get a part open here. So I'm back into SOLIDWORKS CAD, and I'm going to go to my recent here. I've got a Molex connector that we're going to be working with. I'll give that a sec for it to come up there. There we go. So imported body, so downloaded off of some website. I ran import diagnostics on it before I started adding anything to it. You got to do that beforehand. Otherwise you won't be able to do import diagnostics there. The only thing I've done so far is I've established a reference plane and then a sketch of points. And really what I usually shoot for with any component, but more specifically with connectors, is I try to find a spot in the connector where the wire stops. So if I shove it into a pin and I shove that pin into this connector, where is the tip of that wire actually land? Reason I do that is it gives me the most accurate length on my wire coming out of the connector. If you put it on the face, well, then you're going to be short the strip length. Yes, there is a calculated value that you can type in there, but I kind of like to just put my sketch points in ahead of time. I did color the sketch, which is just a kind of a something I do type of thing. You highlight the sketch, and there's this toolbar in the lower right hand corner there that is the line format toolbar. So I use that one to be able to hit this little paintbrush icon to change the color of the sketch. So not necessary, I just do that just so I can see a gray sketch on a gray part there. So going down the route of using the wizard, if I go to the Tools menu, SOLIDWORKS Electrical, and then we use the Electrical Component Wizard. And 21 and older version of Electrical 3D, this is the way you have to go to put in the connection points. I'm going to fire up the wizard there. It does take a little bit of time, the first go of it, and then it takes you right into a selection dialog here. So this page basically allows us to go through and say, okay, what are we going to add to this part? I typically will go C point from manufacturer. This gives me a manufacturer part from the electrical library that I can say, okay, it has 4 connection points, therefore I need to pick 4 points in my part. When you hit the Add button here, it gives us a dialog to select our part, and then we'll select our terminals here in a moment. So this may be kind of stock standard if you've gone through this before. It may be something entirely new. Let's see, I want to find Molex in my manufacturer list. This should look very familiar if you've been in even electrical schematics. This is the same manufacturer part search that you use over there. So it's the same list. This particular part, not that one, it's actually this top one. So this top one, it's got 4 circuits, 4 terminals. So I'm matching what I've done with the manufacturer part. I'm matching what my symbols, my multi-line or my schematic symbols are, and then my 3D part is going to match it. 4 circuits, 4 terminals. The reason I do the connector, I'm going to go and double click on this here. The reason I do the connector with the circuit information opposed to the pins is it's much easier to go through and say, okay, here's the pin location, here's the pin number. If I don't do that, then I would have to, well, essentially do a connection point for 1 pin, but then when I get to the assembly, I would have to associate 10, 12, 50 pins, opposed to just associating the 1 connector. So that's kind of the logic behind doing the connector opposed to the pin, even though the pin is technically what you're connecting to. All right, so in 21 and older versions, the way that I like to go about it is I right-click over the first line there, say Create Connection Point, go and pick out the first one there, which I'm guessing it's that one because we've got a flat on the side there. So when you do that, it goes through, adds the C point, if you've ever done any routing, but it names it specifically, and we'll look at the naming here in a little bit. You can technically highlight this, select the point, and then hit the green check mark, but it is a little bit more time consuming. I tend to do the right click over it, pick the sketch point, and then let it go there. Again, the right click, I'll leave that up for a second longer this time. Create connection point when you right click it in the tree there. Okay, so I'll pick that one. And I'm hoping that I'm getting the pin count in the right spot there. So that's adding the connection points, or the logic behind Electrical 3D that allows each wire to run to it. I'll go and hit OK out of the dialog, just to kind of confirm that it's done it. But because it was pinned open, it leaves it open. It does bring the wizard back up, but I'm going to go and cancel out of that dialog. So that property manager isn't currently running, and I'll bring the wizard back into the foreground. So from here, technically that's enough for what we want to do. There are other options, either on this screen or other screens. One of which that I'm going to briefly talk about is this cable point. This part I don't have set up for a cable point, but I am going to talk about it on a slide here a little bit later. And then there are other things on other parts of this wizard, but you don't have to use all the functionality if you don't need it. So I'm going to go and close out here. So what it did is it took my original sketch and then it made copies of each sketch point into its own separate sketch. If you had a single sketch with a single point, then it just renames your own sketch. So if it sees multiple or other entities in that, it has to make a copy of that sketch there. And then it creates a connection point or a C point that is specifically named. If we're using SOLIDWORKS Premium and we had the routing functionality, and again, not all of you are going to be aware that there's a difference between SOLIDWORKS routing and Electrical 3D. There is a blurred kind of line in between the two, but this functionality is riding on the electrical 3D functionality is riding on the routing functionality. The difference here, though, is it gets renamed. So if I go into the properties of this, so the feature itself is renamed, and then it's very specifically set to route type of electrical, and then cable wire. Yes, there are other options in there. The wizard creates them as cable wires. I just stay with cable wires. That's what I go with. The rest of these items aren't really necessary. The diameter, that gets fed in through the schematic, so that comes from our wire style, so that's not a value. The stub length, yeah, okay, that one does actually show up in our cut length there. Not our cut length. I'm describing that one weird. What this is essentially if this wire is allowed to bend, it has to go out this far before the first bend. So you could kind of adjust that. I'm going to leave it as the default. This is what I was spoke about. Is this one is the value of the additional length. So if I put these sketch points up on the face and I need to account for the strip length, I could essentially change that value. But I'd have to do that for every single C point. So I can technically, in fact, I'm going to erase this last one here. So I'll erase the 3 underscore 0 there. So I delete that C point. And yeah, I'll leave the sketch there. I'll use that one. In fact, I'll hide the other sketch here. So there's that point that doesn't have one. You can technically go tools. Let's see, I don't have. Oh, you know what? Let's just go to the. I thought I had the routing add-in loaded here. Give me one sec. Yep, I do have it loaded. Yeah, that's funny. One of my toolbars is missing there, so I'm just going to turn that toolbar on, the electrical toolbar. And we're over here. Oh, let's see. It's not liking me today for some reason. All right, give me one sec here. I actually do it as a tab. All right, I'm going to go in through. Oh, there it is. That's what I was looking for. So you can turn on a toolbar or create a toolbar or the submenu. For some reason, I was looking farther up. I'm just blanking out here. Oh yeah, not the electrical, sorry, the routing tools there. You can tell that I don't use this method all that often, but it is feasible, possible. So if I was just doing regular routing, this is what you use instead of that wizard. You can also use the wizard. But for electrical, if I do a create connection point via the pull-down menu there, I go and pick out my sketch point. I'll also go and pick out the plane that it's drawn on. So that plane, so I get a point of reference there. I set it for electrical. I set my type for wire cable. And then the rest of the info, again, I can set that up if I needed to. Hit OK there. But then the final step is the official read of it. So I actually have to rename that as 3_0, and then electrical 3D will pay attention to it. If we don't have that, and I'll do a rebuild here just so that'll show up on the screen. But so if I don't have it named that way, it doesn't know that it's on the third. Well, it's the fourth one because we start counting at 0, right? So it's the fourth circuit in the set, labeled 3_0, 0 being the terminal number there. So you can run the wizard, or you can technically create your own sketch points there too. So either way, it does technically work there. All right, so that's adding the intelligence there. I'm going to go and bring up the PowerPoint, and we'll talk about the next item here. So as we're working on components, well, do we want to go through and actually add an EWCable point? So EWCable point for harnesses, because we collect all these schematic symbols and wires on the schematic drawing itself, and we highlighted them, we turned it into a harness. Whether they're cables or not, it will collect all of the individual wires and turn them into a single larger diameter as it's going from from connector to connector there. That collecting can be controlled by an EWCable point, or if your part is missing an EWCable point, it actually does the collection at the start of your EW path. EW path is what controls the direction. Again, if you haven't seen Electrical 3D, we'll actually bring that sketch up here a little bit later. So you can actually go through and do either method on where you want to control it. This one might collect them all together at the assembly level, if your EW path is at the assembly level. So you edit this sketch and move its spot, whereas this would be like a fixed location inside of a part file. So again, either way, as far as how you want to create your parts, I would kind of lean towards pick one and stay with that method, with the rare exceptions there. Another thing that you can do, and I've got a slide for that as well, is you can create EW path sketch at the part level. Again, if you're used to using Electrical 3D, you may not have realized that you can do this. There is no button for it, so when we do EW paths at the assembly level, there's a button that says make me a new path. An EW path, all it is a 3D sketch, so it has to be 3D, and it has to be named EW_path. You can put numbers at the end of it. In fact, I think I've heard that you can even do names at the end of it. I haven't tried that myself, but as long as the first part is matching there. In fact, let me just go and bring up that part here so you can kind of see. So this is the one we were just working on. Let me open up the altered version of it here. So if I open this guy, so currently I have it suppressed, so I'll just go and unsuppress it here. So this sketch, I'll rotate it around so you can kind of see what it's doing there. I'll do it slow enough, but it's essentially a 3D sketch that is drawn in space here. And if you've never done 3D sketches, it's not that difficult. These start out at a sketch point. They go have a sketch relation along Z. I set it to a specific distance. I do another one out here in space. Again, maybe aligned with the origin of the part. Set a distance, and then I just connect the dots to get all of them. Again, you can get more fancier with that. These are just lines that I'm doing, and I'm sure with some of the other webinars that were in this series, you'll see other options there too. So, but you have the ability of kind of deciding what you're doing with that. All right, so now that we've created an intelligent part, we've added the connection points that are specifically named. Now we need to decide, okay, where are the parts going to reside at? Are they going to exist in the project folder for electrical on the electrical server, or are they going to reside in the spot that we left them at? Okay, so how do we decide that? Well, that's a setting that's actually done individually per machine. So let's get back to SOLIDWORKS here. In fact, I'll close out of this part here. Two ways of getting into your application settings. One is right-click in the blank area on the right there, Application Settings, or I can also go Tools, SOLIDWORKS Electrical, Tools, Application Settings. So this is a machine specific, and if you have electrical schematics and electrical 3D on the same machine, it's the same interface. It's not until you restart the opposite program. So like if I made the change to the application settings on the schematics program, I would need to restart SOLIDWORKS CAD for these changes to show up. So the item that I want to bring everybody's attention to is this guy right here. So this copy 3D part to project. So that setting is on by default, and what it does is it goes to wherever you source that file from, and then during the association, and it happens for some associations and not others. In fact, I'd have to go test it to remind myself which one does it, which one doesn't, because we'll be talking about the three methods of associating. With this copy part on, it makes a copy and puts it into that subfolder of the project on the electrical server. So now you have two files, one in the original source, one in the project file, which may be good, especially if you're going to duplicate that file, archive the project, send it out to somebody. If we uncheck that, it leaves the part in its original source location. So in our case, I'm going to uncheck it so that it actually leaves my parts in PDM or in a folder outside of the electrical server. So that's something as far as controlling the parts there. Another thing that might be beneficial too is if you are going to have your parts outside of the vault, you can change the library directory of where it's pulling the files from. This is kind of defaulting to the electrical server, a subfolder called SLDPRT, even though there may be assemblies in there. That's what they call the folder. But I can go ahead and hit the ellipses button there, jump out to my vault here, and then get into, let's see, I think I put it into libraries, and then I've got an electrical parts folder. So that folder has all of my parts that I'll be using in different projects, different electrical assemblies. So now, of course, it turns that on again, so I'll uncheck that one more time. But then that can be a repository for pre-assigning a part to a manufacturer. I'll see that here in a moment as well. All right, so I'm going to go and hit OK there. I'm going to go and open up my assembly. So I'm going to double click on that. So this assembly, I did start on it ahead of time, got the parts in there. I did bring in the, or created the EW path sketch. But let's kind of take a look at how this particular one is constructed. So one of the things I kind of briefly mentioned last week, I'll probably mention it again this week though, is on the schematic, we actually wanted to account for other parts for each component. Things like pins, back shells, that type of thing. So that type of thing, in fact, let me jump over to the electrical component tab here. So let me back up just a sec here. So because we linked this this assembly to this project, the next time we open that assembly, we get the component tree. Had we just opened this assembly from outside of electrical or outside of the electrical project, this tab would not be available. It's that linking that brings up this component tree there. All right, so getting back to the setup here, you know, let me bring up the schematic here. So we're switching programs for a moment. Don't mean to confuse anybody, but we're back in the schematics program for just a moment. If I go into the component properties of P1 here, I jump over to the manufacturer parts and circuit. This one manufacturer, or this one P1 component, has the housing, which has the circuit info, and then I added however many pins that I'm actually using. Even if it was like a 4-pin connector, I could remove one of the pins if I didn't want it to show up in the electrical bill of materials. So that's one way of organizing your parts, and that's on P1. If we go to P2, this one is still a connector and the pins, but we used an electrical assembly to group them together. So the assembly allows me to insert those very quickly into the well, in this case, the P2 component. So I have my housing and I've got my 3 pins. The reason I'm showing this does change what we see happens on the 3D side of things. So P2 and also P3. So P3 doesn't have pins because it's an Amphenol, but with like embedded pins, but it does have the other things like the coupler, the insert, the back shell. All those things are extra pieces of this one. Okay. So now let's get back over to 3D. So we're going to switch programs again. Again, don't mean to confuse anybody, but you need to kind of see what's driving it. So when we get back over here, so P1 is our Molex connector. We have one for the main connector itself. So for each one of the manufacturer parts in P1, we get an item in the list here. When we look at P2, well, because it's actually pulling in the electrical assembly, I call mine kits, but it's an electrical assembly, we only get one item to do the association with. So there's a little bit of kind of difference between those two. So getting into kind of the next stage. So let's bring up the PowerPoint here so we stay on our roadmap here. So we talked about where the components should reside. So the next thing is associating the parts. Where should they reside at? Not where should they reside at? How should we create the connection between what's in the assembly, the 3D space, and the component tree on the left-hand side there. So there is three methods, or kind of what I call three methods of doing that. So let me get back into SOLIDWORKS CAD here, again with the electrical 3D add-in loaded. So the first one here, I'm going to go into the component properties. So I'm right-click over P1 itself, go to Properties, Manufacture Parts and Circuit tab. I go over to the Molex connector. I go to the properties of that first connector part. And what I'm looking at here is essentially showing that this one is not pre-associated to another part. The reason I'm doing that is just so that when I go to do an insert, well, I can't say just right-click insert because it's going to give me something generic. I would normally do a right-click and insert from file. So let me back up here a sec. So if it didn't already exist in the assembly, I guess is probably the better way of doing it. I would do a right-click, insert from file, so that's method 1. And that goes through and allows you to browse to where that file would exist at. And as soon as you select it, well, you know what, let me go and drop in another one. I'll reassociate that one here in a sec. So let me do an insert from file just to show you method 1 here. So method 1, I'm going to go out to my library. Actually, I'm going to go out to the folder I've got set up for this project here. Okay, so webinar, and I'll go and grab my, well, in this case, I'm just going to do the connector itself. So I'm going to go and do an, let's do that one here. So I'll go do an open. Stuck to my cursor is my connector, and it says it's associated. So now this electrical project knows that one to be P1, or the first part of P1. So that one is certainly viable. I'm going to actually delete the model here and show method 2 here. So method 2 is associating something that's already in the assembly. So again, a mechanical assembly first, a mechanical person could go through, build this assembly, and then when you do the link, it converts it to an electrical assembly. So I'll go and do a right-click, associate, and then I associate it to the connector itself. When I hit OK here, it's going to ask me a question here. Associate to the part or the assembly? I've got a little bit of explaining to do as far as why this popped up. So I'm going to say with part, and the reason that I need to say part is the example that I'm using is I'm actually doing sub-assembly. So I actually have a sub-assembly that contains my connector and all of the pins. I'm not going to go through the association of all the pins, but you will see that I'll end up with 4 items that are pop up in the dialog saying when I go to route the harness that those aren't associated. Okay. So the positronic one, kind of very similar setup. Essentially, I right-click over it, I say associate. So again, this is method 2. Pick out the connector, hit the OK there. I want to associate it to the part. The assembly doesn't have a connection point, so that's why I'm not associating it to that. But then I don't have the pins to associate as well. Okay. The third method, and yes, I already have the Amphenol connector in there, but the third method of associating, I'm going to look at the properties of P3, look at the manufacturer part for the contacts part of the Amphenol connector, properties of it, and then down here, I actually already have it pointing, or I have it pre-associated to a library location of where that connector resides at. Drawback to this one though is I can only do it to a part and it associate correctly. If I do it to a sub-assembly, it won't associate, or at least last time I tested it. Might be different in this service pack, but again, only a part. So that the whole theory of doing assemblies for your setup may not work for this. So I'm just going to do one of these real quick. So method 3 is just a regular insert, and because it's pre-associated, oh yeah, it's giving me height differences there. That's fine, but look at that. It didn't actually grab the right part. This was quickly set up beforehand, but it should have grabbed and brought in the right part there. I think maybe because I remapped my path location for the library, I probably needed to remap it. In fact, let's just do that real quick. I know we're running towards the end of the hour already. Time flies by here. So I'm going to go back into my properties, back to my manufacturer parts. And I'm going to hit the ellipses button there on the 3D parts area there. And again, I'm going to grab the Amphenol part portion there. So that guy right there. Oh, yeah, pathing's different there. Okay. All right, let's try that again here. So right-click, Insert from File. Yeah, all right, well, something I did up in the setup just beforehand, but that theory does work. To be honest, the one I use the most is the Insert from File, just because I'm building the assembly as I'm going and I pick out the parts. But yeah, that last one should work had I set it up correctly. So I'm just going to do an associate here. So I'm going to use, since it exists in the assembly, I'm going to do that already. Okay. Associate with part. So I've associated parts within these 3 sub-assemblies. I've also created a 3D sketch inside of my assembly. The 3D sketch, if you haven't done 3D sketches, a good recommendation that I always like to do is work from standard angles. So switch to the top view, only work from the top view. And then you can use the Shift and arrow key to rotate to 90 degrees. And then you can look at it from the right view. The reason I do that is when you move it and you're only looking at a standard orientation, it's only going to move two dimensions. It's not going to move in 3. If you're in an isometric view, it's very easy for it to get all 3 points oriented differently there. So I also will fix a point once I get it to a spot where I like it. I'll fix it into space so it doesn't move again. But all right, so that's the 3D sketch there. That one was using the create route path, so it names it correctly for you. It also changes the color, but again, it's just a 3D sketch with that specific name there. All right, so moving on here. Again, keeping the flow going here for the end. So when we route items in Electrical 3D, we can route wires, we can route cables. So either if we just put wires on a schematic, that's what we get. We need to route wires. Same thing with cables. If we take wires, convert them into cables, that's what we use, the button to route cables. But if we've taken either one of those, wires or cables, and selected them and switched them into a harness, then we use the route harness button to run them. So briefly jumping back to the schematics program, any part, if you right click over it, or you can do multiples at the same time, add or remove from harness, and you can very quickly see if it's already been associated to a harness. So this one has the connector and all of its pins. It doesn't hurt to hit OK there, the green check mark, reselect the harness and hit select again. It doesn't hurt to do that. So you need to do that for all symbols, all wires and cables to be able to route it. Alright, so let's jump into routing it. So I'm going to switch programs here again. So back over to our really descriptive PowerPoint there. But let's get back into 3D here. Alright, so I'm back into the assembly there. Habit of mine is I always hit the save just before I route harness. So I hit the route harness button there. So up there at the top, oops, let me back out there. I think it jumped into that a little quick there. So there's the route harness button there at the top center. Okay. takes us into this dialog. I'm going to tell it to use splines for settings, and then these values, just briefly, I'm going to talk about them. I know they may come up in one of the other webinars, but the way I describe this one is this first value is if I had a gap between two EW paths, that's the maximum distance it's allowed to jump. If it's beyond that, then the wire makes its own decision. This one is from the connection point, so the connection point inside of a connector relative to the start of the EW path, or even the well, I guess the EW path is probably the best way of describing that. So I'm going to go and run this one. I do have it to show errors. We will get at least 4 that I'm aware of, just because we have those pins of the Molex that we did not associate. So, as far as the need to associate those pins versus not, I don't know if there is a fixed reason or a need to do that. Because it doesn't change the bill of material on the electrical side, doesn't change the bill of material on the 3D side. I guess it would show up in a design rule check report saying that you have a part that isn't associated. So I guess you would see it there though. But yeah, so I've got, oh, actually, I have a cable part that I didn't associate either, so I don't have anything visually to represent that. But then I have the 4 pins. Oh, and looks like I have one minimum bend radius there between P1 and P3 there. So there is a preview tab here, or preview button, which there it goes. I don't technically use that myself. It is there. All it does is get you into edit route. But an easy way of doing it after you close that dialog is if I right click and I say edit route on that new subassembly it created, is it'll give you a little flag indicating where the problem's at. Okay. That's probably because my EW path is too close there, or going off at a weird angle. But all right, so the other thing to point out with the method that I just used here is because these parts are in subassemblies and I only associated the part, it kind of does a sleight of hand thing. What it does is it takes a copy of the part that you associated, it hides it, which technically removes it from the bill of materials, which normally a hide doesn't do that. A suppress would, but a hide normally doesn't. But in this case it does. And then it makes a copy of that part into the route subassembly. Looks like I only got 2 of them there, the positronic and the Molex. My Amphenol didn't make it in there, so I'm probably picking on things too quickly. But so those actually get copied into that. So what you're visually seeing is the one that's in this route subassembly that got created. The reason for that is when you go to flatten route, and I'm just going to do a very quick one just because we're out of time, and that is something that we'll again show in one of the other webinars. I'm going to go and do a right click over it. I'm going to go and do a flatten route. There is 2 different versions of flatten route, an annotation version or a manufactured version. Yeah, so that one connector didn't make it, but I'll go and hit OK here. I'm not going to make a drawing, but just hit OK there to create that route there. So when you say flatten route, what the software does is it creates another configuration. So annotation flatten route copies those parts in there if they made it into the route subassembly. So that's one of those things of, okay, why it's hiding that one part in my subassembly, copies it in, is so that it'll show up in the flatten route there. That being said, these these configurations that it creates in the subassembly are kind of special in the sense that I can't just add another part. So my insert component is missing. So if I had a lock clip or a zip tie or a back shell that I wanted to show in a flattened version, I can't do that. So kind of one of the final things I'm going to leave you with before we talk about wire is, in some cases, if you're just, your sole purpose is building the flattened version of this, maybe actually doing the flatten route via the right click isn't the right idea, you can go through, let me just get this saved here. I've got an alternate version that hasn't been converted yet, but I have another assembly here. Oh, I can get that saved as well. This is showing up on the other dial or other screen there. But if I open up an alternate version, let's see, where did I put that at? Oh, there we go. So kind of the same assembly, you'd have to go through and do the association, but all of these, even though this is a 3D sketch for the EW path, all of my parts are planar. And kind of the idea behind that is I could kind of wire it up as if it was going to be on a drawing or going to be on a pin board. And then I don't do the flatten route, and I could add other things to the route subassembly. So I could add zip ties, back shells, clips, all that type of stuff. So, all right, so let's get back to the assembly that I did have open. Let's get that one back open. So one of the things that the software does, and while it's loading that, yes, rebuild, bring up the next PowerPoint slide, is it automatically adds the wire links to our report. So all of our reports now reflect the wire lengths of those harnesses. So again, if you're looking at a wire list report or a harness wire list report, it depends on which how you've got your reports customized there. So in my case, I did a customized version. I'll need to do an update, but so I actually have a modified wire list or wires listed in a harness. If I open it right now, it's not up to date. Can't do the update from here on it, but I can, however, go into my Tools menu, Electrical, down to my project, and pull up my Reports Manager. Again, this is a similar dialog that you do over on the schematic side, but I can say, okay, go and rerun those reports, and I'll just let it run through all of them. While that's running there, another thing that you want to kind of note about is the if you're doing manual edits, which I'm not showing here, but if you're doing manual edits, there is a button you have to push. And actually, my counterpart Jonathan Lieber's on this call listening in, and I'm sure he'll probably show that in his one of his webinars. So just because I won't be able to get to it. So which, to that point, and thank you for my counterparts that put that into the chat there. There is, let me get my slide up here. There's 2 more webinars coming up in this series. So that's kind of where I'm wrapping mine up, is we got to the point of being able to route harness. But the next 2, those are the dates, the 29th of September and the 6th. Go out to that website, GoEngineer.com. Definitely can register for those there. And that's actually right at time there. So I'll leave you with some fun slides to pass through. GoEngineer has recently gotten bigger, so there's our new territory map there. Excellent. We'll go and wrap this one up, and join back with us next Thursday. Have a good one, everybody.